like to thank everybody for starting off their day by going into the nitty-gritty of mobile, whatever that is. So a couple of questions just to help me get a feel for you folks, just to see how deep or not deep I should go. Are any of you programmers or IT people by trade or in a past life? Okay, is anybody convinced that computers are the scourge of the world? Good, okay, obviously an ex-IT guy. Okay, is anybody looking at mobile now, whatever that is? Is anybody interested? Okay, you are. Have you defined what the word mobile actually means? Okay, little background. The idea here is to be able to get to that. And that's actually the screen for an app that I did for a church outside Boston, Massachusetts. It's in submission to the App Store, which is a story in and of itself. But the idea is to get to that without getting to this, or at least bypassing this, because the thing about working with computers in general is that it can be very, what's the word I'm looking for, traumatic, if you're not careful. And the point of this presentation is to try to reduce the trauma somewhat and to actually show you that it may be more doable than you imagine to take your church online. So in a nutshell, basically what I am is, I don't know what I am anymore. My mother used to just say Neil does something with computers and change the subject. But I've been in the field for 34 years. I started off as a technical writer and got involved in hypertext in the early web in the early 80s, mid 80s, got involved with mobile in 1998. So I've been training on mobile, consulting on mobile, developing mobile since 98, long before the iPhone days. And what you're getting is sort of a collection of horror stories, hopefully with solutions. So there's a bunch of certifications here. I actually got a very nice introduction at a conference years ago. The organizer stood up and said, "This is Neil, he's certifiable," sat down and spent the rest of the session laughing. It's actually one of the better introductions I've ever gotten. The important one is right here. This is this tool called VisiApps. I'll explain what this is a little further along. So what I want to do in this first session is cover three questions. Why go mobile in the first place? Why are we even talking about this? The second question is, what is mobile? And that sounds like one of these Zen questions, but it's actually a crucial question, because in all my years in computing, I find that some of the most entertaining horror stories, and entertaining horror stories are the ones that happen to you, not to me. Some of the most entertaining horror stories are the ones that happen because of terminology misunderstandings. So it's important to nail down what you're talking about. And then the third thing is, how do we do it? How do we go mobile, depending on what definition we want? And the idea is to get there like this. It's never a straight line path. You're always going to sort of wander around a little bit, but you're heading toward a direction, as opposed to this or this. All right, do any of you have more money than you need? Okay, yeah, no one has ever said yes to that question. So let me start off by presenting an overview of mobile. Starting with why go mobile? Why are we even looking at this? A couple of reasons. The main one is provide information when users want it, which is invariably now. In other words, the days when you could be walking around someplace and it occurs to you, gee, I wonder what the name of, what does biola stand for? So you make a little note, stick it in your pocket, and you remember to go back to the office and look it up when you get back to the office. You don't want to wait anymore. You just want the answer now. Good morning. You just want the answer now. So second thing is, you want the answer where you are now, not having to wait to go back to the office. Sir, here you go. Yep. Not having to wait to go back to the office. Oops, sorry about that. And this is crucial. This is actually a big selling point in mobile. People want the information where they are now. I'll tell you that, well, the greatest mobile app I have ever seen anywhere was the first app that I ever saw that would give you an online guide to public toilets in the London Underground. Because if you think about it, you want that information where you are and you want it now. And if you've ever been marching around with a 2-year-old who has to go potty right now, you would kill for an app like that. And we want to give it to people how they expect it. We hear, and it's true, that mobile devices are starting to replace the PC. Mobile devices have been outselling PCs for several years. More and more mobile devices are being web-enabled. In other words, for all intents and purposes, the world is going mobile. I actually march around with two, an iPhone and an Android, because I support both. Plus, it's just fun pulling these out of my pockets as a little prop. But the reality is, more and more people are walking around with phones. The only thing is this, because you can go online and search for statistics about mobile device adoption, and you'll find many, many statistics. The problem is you can find statistics to prove any point you want to make. With a little effort, I could go back and find statistics that I found in 1999 that said mobile is it, throw away your PC, etc. It's finally starting to happen, but you treat any statistics with a large grain of salt. What kinds of outputs are we talking about when we go mobile? Well, there's a couple of things. One of them is to take desktop apps and mobilize them. And by that I mean we're taking a familiar desktop app and simply scrunching it down into a mobile device, but the general usage model is the same. You know, weather.com on whatever size screens these things are, 19-inch. Weather.com on this is basically the same mental model as weather.com on an iPhone. There's nothing new to learn. But then we can get to some novel, new kinds of apps that were never available. They never existed before. For example, one of the most novel things I found was something several years ago called a footy bar finder. Is anybody here from England? Okay. There's a joke that England and the United States are two countries separated by a common language. A footy bar finder was an app that would allow you to find a bar where you could drink beer while watching World Cup soccer based on GPS. In other words, it would know where you were, and it would direct you to the nearest bar where you could watch World Cup soccer. Card swipe and NFC-based apps. If you've ever seen something like this, where you can actually buy something on a credit card in the field. In fact, Jason Caston has one of these if you want to buy one of his books. You can actually swipe a credit card through a little reader plugged into an iPhone. Inventory data entry in the field, contact lead tracking at trade shows or expositions. You know, if you're at the Biola.digital conference and you want to make a note, I met this lady from such and such, and she sounded really interesting. I want to email her. You can take little notes on your iPhone. They could be for homilies recorded in the field. I am certified by and do customer support, tech support for an app development tool based out of Boston. And one of the things that we've been talking about is creating an app that would let, say, ministers record homilies or devotionals in the field. In other words, you catch the minister in the parking lot and say, hey, what would you like to say today to the congregation? And the minister could actually record. It's almost like a little audio studio in the palm of your hand. We can do this now. E-books. They could be e-books that you simply want to read someplace. Here's an example, obviously, and I have no idea how many Bibles there are in mobile form, in app form. There's got to be hundreds. I started counting once and gave up. It just, whenever the word hundreds comes into the sentence, who cares at that point? But you can already find any kind of ebook. You might want to create some sort of output purely as a brand differentiator. And this is bringing sort of commercial speak into the ministry world. But the reality is a lot of churches have older congregations, but a lot of churches have younger congregations. And if you want to reach that market, if you want to reach that audience, you have to speak their language. One of the reasons I'm here is that the associate pastor at the church I attend is, I think he's 32, and he's a total gearhead. And as far as he's concerned, the world cannot get mobilized fast enough. And there's an increasing number of younger people in the congregation who walk around with iPhones and Android phones, and you want to reach them. By the way, as I go through this, if anybody has any questions or comments, by all means. So, all right, what I want to do is get a little techie. I promise no code, no programming language, but more like what's the environment into which you're moving if you want to go mobile. And the idea is to avoid this. All right, is anybody not sure who this is? Okay, if you're not sure, this is Bullwinkle J. Moose from the old Rocky the Flying Squirrel TV show. And Bullwinkle's thing was always he was going to pull a rabbit out of a hat, and it always backfired. And the problem is, it's funny in a cartoon. It's not so funny when it's happening in a real environment. You want to avoid this. So, little techie 101. One of the problems is that people toss around the word mobile without really defining what it means. So here's a question: what is mobile in the physical sense? This is mobile. Sorry, did anybody ever have one of these? Okay. I always feel like I'm at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting when I ask this question. Hi, my name is Neil, and I had an Osborne. But I had one of these, and I walked it around the airport in Boston, and in the early 80s, and people were coming up to me and saying in hushed tones, "Is that a computer?" And I would say, "Yes, would you like to touch it?" Because this was so novel at the time. Of course, the thing was the size and weight of a portable sewing machine. And you can look back on it now, and it's laughable, but at the time, that was mobile. Which, of course, got replaced by this, which now weighs, you can get them for about 2.5 pounds, and I find that people are still complaining, which just goes to show that we can always find something to complain about. But then we get to this, tablets, which are extensions of smartphones. This is interesting. If you've ever been to Starbucks, this is actually an augmented reality app. If you point the phone at a coffee cup that has the Valentine's Day heart, this was last year, you would get special love notes scrolling across the screen. And this is going to be extended by this, Google Glass. Is anybody not familiar with Google Glass? You've all heard of it. This is basically a virtual reality goggle system, but the old ones looked like something that was worn by Luke Skywalker. The thing might weigh 10 pounds. And it was the size of a motorcycle crash helmet. This is like a pair of glasses. And the idea is this little thing right here projects the equivalent of, I forget exactly what it is, it's something like a 21-inch screen from about 2.5 feet away. So the idea is you'll be able to walk around seeing the world in one eye and seeing the virtual world in the other eye, but this is getting increasingly mobile because I already hear people complaining about the trauma of having to pull a smartphone out of their pocket. Okay, so, who knows? What do you want to mobilize? This is actually one of the biggest issues. And again, some of what I'm going to say here and going forward is going to sound a little nitpicky, but these are crucial questions to answer before you start doing any work. Because if you don't, it's very easy to go several months down into a project only to realize that you are going in the wrong direction, or it's just not going to work. So second question is, what do you want to make mobile? Do you want to mobilize large amounts of text? And again, the Bible is an obvious example of large amounts of text that you might want to read on a mobile device, but you might have your church history or anything else that's sort of book-like, whatever that means to you. On the other hand, you might want to do information. And information is a little bit different. It's textual, but it's not really text like a book. It's more like small, concentrated chunks of information like worship times. So this is one of the pages in the app that I did. And this is the basic church information. And this tells you where and when the Sunday services are held, where the office is, and if you click either of these two buttons, or tap, one of the problems is trying to remember, do I say click or tap? If you tap these two buttons, it opens up Google Maps. It will come back and ask for permission to use your current location and then find the office or the church on the map. You want to do non-textual stuff. Non-textual stuff might be links to sermons. They might be podcasts. They might be video links. They might be donation links. In other words, tap here to make a donation. Where is this stuff going to be? Where's the stuff going to be held? Now, here's a question. How many of you have a phone now? Everybody's, okay, good. That's becoming increasingly common. I still find places where people don't have phones, but generally people do. But the major issue here is I don't care whether you have a phone. The question is, do you have internet access? Because the question is, if you have internet access, you have total flexibility. The app and the data can be sitting on the device. In other words, you create a church app. You create an app for your church, and that app gets installed on the device, which means you don't need internet access because the app is on the device. The problem is, what if the data, what if the service times, what if the sermon podcasts are not on the device, but they're on a server someplace else? In order to read, to use that information, you need internet access, okay? So if the stuff is on the device, you don't have to worry about having internet access because it's all on the device. The problem is people have to download the app or the mobile thing. That's not a problem. We download apps all the time. The problem is not from the user's perspective, from our perspective, the developer's perspective. If the app is on your device, what happens when the app changes? Well, I have to send you a notice that says, hey, the app has changed. And you'll get an update note on the phone that says app has changed. And it's just one of those things that you do. But it's one more little detail that you have to worry about when it comes to maintenance. If the app is sitting on a server, it's not on your device, but it's sitting on a server someplace, that means that you have to have internet access in order to get to it. But it's a lot easier to maintain it because now I don't have to worry about maintaining copies on 10 people's devices. All I have to do is maintain it once on the server. So it becomes a lot simpler. Is anybody thinking this is sounding awfully nitty-gritty? Good. Because hold that thought. The question was, how about a hybrid? Hold that thought. Variability. How often does the information change? How much does it change? So, and again, which means you have to know something about your information. Generally, most information in an app like a church app doesn't really change that much. So locations are pretty standard. Times are pretty standard. What will change will be things like event notifications. Obviously those are going to change weekly, sometimes daily. So you do have to worry about that. Most of the stuff is pretty standard though. But the more it changes, the more you have to worry about updating, which means the more you have to worry about, is the app sitting on the device or is it sitting up on a server someplace, which will tell you what kind of app you're creating. How much material do you have? Apps, if you think about it, are text light. There's very little text in an app. Aside from something like the Bible, this is actually considered heavy text for an app. There's a lot here. But this entire description ends about 5 lines down. In other words, this is text heavy for an app. But for what you're used to, this is nothing. This is 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs. That's it. So the question is, how much material do you have? What do your users expect? Can you guys, when I say you guys, it's the Boston term, the New England term, all you people in the room. Ladies, every once in a while somebody yells at me for saying that, so I just want to make sure you don't. Do you guys know the demographics of your church? Anybody? Okay, good. So if you know the demographics, do you know what they expect? Because on the one hand, we have this sense that the younger the demographic, the more they're going to be using smartphones, mobile devices. But on the other hand, I know people in their 20s who are terrified of mobile devices, whereas I know people in their 60s who have just gotten tablets and are running around like crazy people with them. Look at everything I can do. So, but the question is, what do your users expect? Do they expect something relatively staid like this? Or do they expect something like more like this? Right? If you're not sure what this is, does anybody know what this is? This is a game called Fruit Ninja. And somebody is throwing fruit at you, and you have to slice it with your sword, which consists of running your fingernail up and down the screen. And it's a silly game, but it's surprisingly fun. And also, somebody who likes this may approach your church app with a very different mindset, a very different expectation. You have to be aware of that, because you don't want to do something that half your users are going to look at and go, ooh, boring. All right, so where do you publish this stuff? In other words, let's say that you have created the content, you've defined the mobile, whatever it is you're creating. Where do you publish it? How do you make it available to the users? A couple of things. Are you using your own server? Do you guys work, do any of you work for a church that has its own server? Okay, which means that you're going to have to lease space on a server somewhere, and that's quite easy to do, but it's one more thing to think about. Using Amazon for ebooks. How many of you have tablets? Sorry, Kindle, a Nook, anybody? Okay, interesting, just the 3 of you. Okay, I can take a book and very easily put it on a Kindle, put it on a Nook. The Nook comes from Barnes & Noble. And is that an app per se? No. Is it mobile? Absolutely. I can easily carry it around in the field and read wherever I want. And you can very easily create an ebook and put it into Amazon. I can actually walk you through the process if you really cared. I also have some links that I'll get to in a few slides further down that tells you how to do it. Are you creating a real app? This is different, because there are basically 2 standards for apps. There's more, but basically there's 2. There's Apple and Android. And then there's this sort of 7 dwarves, like unfortunately Microsoft, Nokia, RIM, and various others that are slipping quickly or that just have not taken off yet. But if you create an app, you have to make it available to me, your users, so that I can download it by going to the store on whatever device I'm using. So sort of extending my earlier question, you guys all have phones of one kind or other. How many of you have an Android? The rest of you have iPhones? Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so it's about 60% Apple, 40% Android in here, which actually sort of flips the current statistics. Right now, it's about 60%, it's about 70% Android and 30% Apple. But, you know, let's say it's close enough. If you want to make something available for the Android users, You're going to put it in the Android store. It's called the Play Store. And this is pretty easy to do. Android basically says, yeah, whatever you have, send it to us, and we'll pretty happily put it up there. Apple is a different story. Do I have any Mac users here? All right, do I have any Mac lovers here? Are you armed? Just so I'll know if it's safe to tell Mac jokes. The problem with Apple is that they are incredibly demanding. They are incredibly finicky. The app, this church app that I mentioned and that I'll show you later in the second session, I've now submitted 3 times and been turned down 3 times. The first time I was turned down because it failed a download speed test on an iPad. And my reaction was, but it's not aimed at an iPad. And they said, well, we're testing for iPad download. And I said, but it's not an iPad app. And they said, yeah, go away, fix it. So we went away, we fixed it, we thought, resubmitted it. They came back and they said, you failed by something like a millisecond. You failed the speed test. Okay, go back, submit it, pass the speed test, got turned down the 3rd time. Interestingly, the 3rd time it got turned down had nothing to do with speed. Turns out, just to show you, does anybody here have a legal background? Does anybody like reading contracts? You want to read Apple's agreements very, very carefully, because Apple can turn you down for any reason it wants. The reason the app got turned down the 3rd time, and I had to do sort of rip out part of the app, was that in the app there was a link which, when tapped, would take you to the main donations page on the main church site. Because the church has a website, they have a donations page that's run by a 3rd-party company that creates church donation pages with all the security built in, and you can pretty much take this donations page and drop it into your church's website like a unit. So I created a link, tap here, jump to that page, that way I wouldn't have to recreate all the security. Apple turned it down because of that. They said any donations have to go through Safari, which is the Apple browser, because Apple wants its finger in every single pie, and I had to rip that out. So you can be surprised in any number of ways, and probably will be. Plus, by the way, you need a Mac. Does anybody here have a Mac? Okay. Are you coders with a Mac, or it's more like you're Mac users? Okay. In order to do this, you have to go through some fairly convoluted steps on the Mac, which are new to a lot of people. Some author requirements. Do you want to do this in-house as opposed to hiring somebody? All right. The company that I do tech support for offers professional services. Think of this as sort of a blatant sales pitch, but on the other hand, we also know that a lot of people want to do it on their own. Partly because they want to do it on their own, and partly because we don't want to spend the money, which makes perfect sense. So if you want to do this in-house, then there's a couple of things you want to ask. Why are we doing this? Biggest question. And again, that's kind of a vague question, but I'll tell you what it boils down to. I have been doing pre-sales customer support for this company for about 2 years. And what happens is if you get an account with their software, you'll get an email thanking you profusely and saying, we can give you an 1 hour free overview of the app development process, and talk to this guy named Neil, and he'll do a Skype session or a WebEx and show you how it works. I can tell within about 2 minutes whether you're serious. Because what I find is that there's 3 reasons for doing an app that mean it may happen. They're all business reasons. One reason says we are creating the app to increase revenue. We want to make more money. Second reason says we're creating the app to reduce costs, which is basically the same thing as make more money, increase revenue. Third reason we're doing it is we're doing it for branding. We want to show that our church is catering to the sensibilities of the younger members of the congregation. We are a cutting-edge, future-forward kind of church. And that works. That's valid. I do run into a lot of cases where the response is, well, it's so cool. Or my kid wants to do it as an 8th grade science project. Something like that. And it's tempting because the development tool is free. You literally pay nothing for the development tool. The cost is in the hosting. And it's still pretty cheap. It's about $100 a month, which in the mainstream commercial sense is almost throwaway. In the church sense, not necessarily. It all adds up. But the reality is it's pretty cheap. So if it turns out that you really are doing it, then who's going to be doing it? Because I've run into places where the attitude is, well, maybe the church secretary can do it. Well, no. It's a little bit, you can't just say, we'll let the secretary do it. In the church for which I did the app, the whole thing was started by the associate pastor, the 32-year-old gearhead, and he actually wants to do a lot of it, but I know that he has so many other responsibilities. He really can't do it. So I set the app up so that once the app is set up, it's running on its own, and there's only a couple of very specific cases where the ministerial staff actually has to get involved. But everything else pretty much runs on its own. Whoever's doing it, how techie are they? And this is important. And I'll show you some examples of why it's important a few slides further. But a little detour. Is anybody familiar with the difference between SOAP and REST? Anybody know RSS and Atom? Okay. How big a part of their job is the mobile side? Every single person I know who works in a church is saturated. They have more work and less time than they know what to do with. And it's to simply come along and say, hey, we're going to give you one more assignment. Usually doesn't work well. Something is going to slip, and we don't want the app to be what slips. Getting a little more specific, we know what ebooks are. They're electronic books, basically. They are usually most commonly used for linear text, like books, like the Bible. There may be a few graphics, but not really much else. There are different output formats that you can use. They're called basically EPUB and MOBI. And in English, all this means is that they are the types of formats that different ebooks accept. The Amazon Kindle uses this format called MOBI. Then there's EPUB for the Barnes & Noble Nook. So again, you sort of have to know what your users have, which means you have to do a survey. Do any of your churches have an IT department? You do. Is it, when I say department, is that you, ma'am? So you really have a department. Okay, do they have an inventory? Do they keep any kind of inventory of what equipment your users, your congregation has?
Congregation?
Yeah.
Yes, congregation, not so much.
Okay, but they do have some sense, and they could do polls, you know, to say, hey, we're going to go mobile, but we need to know what to support. Please tell us what you use. Something like that. Sir, what about you?
Well, I don't work in that department. I just know that we have a massive organization in IT.
Interesting. Massive, that's not a word that I usually hear in association with church IT departments.
What's a big church?
Obviously. What
It's
church?
not a big church.
Oh, okay, I take it back. Okay, then you may be a model for everything else that goes on. So they could be smartphones, and the content is actually sitting on the device. It is surprisingly easy to read a book on this thing. You wouldn't think so at first, but it's surprisingly easy to do. Could also be a Word document that you just convert to PDF format and put on the device, which is about as boring as you can get, but it does work. Then we get to the real meat, the apps. So the word app is obviously short for application. The word app has been around for years. I remember people talking about mainframe apps 30 years ago. But nowadays it really means something on a smartphone or a tablet. So they are very focused compared to traditional desktop applications. I've got a bunch of apps on these two things, but they are very focused on one or two specific tasks. Here's the app that I have to put in a prescription to my local Walgreens. Here's the app that I have to put in a reservation for a super shuttle at any airport in North America, et cetera. They're so focused that the term is sometimes microtasking. They do a micro task. They do one very tiny thing. They do it really well. Sometimes they do it really badly. There's two kinds. Generally, they're called native and web. I'll get to hybrid as sort of an offshoot. Native apps are apps that are native to or follow a standard. So most common ones are the iPhone apps, which follow the iPhone or iOS standard, and the Android standard. And the beauty of these things is that because they follow a standard, they're very tightly integrated into the devices. And the effect is that it's easy to run what are called on-device resources. These would be, for example, the camera that's built into the phone. I can create an app and add a camera to an app page in the app in under 10 mouse clicks. And I have a working camera. Very easy to do. The accelerometers that measure how you're holding the phone and rotate the display. These are controlled by little gravitational sensors, basically, called accelerometers inside the phone. The GPS, the global positioning system, incredibly accurate. This is how the phone can figure out where you are and tell you how to get to the church. Very easy to do. The apps are on the device. The app itself is downloaded to the device, which is why it runs so quickly. And the content, the data, the sermon listing, the sermon times, the church address, they may be on the device or they may be on a server someplace else for which you need internet access. So these sound like the best of all worlds. And to a degree they are, except there's one problem, which is that you have to make sure that you do something in your app that works on all variants of that platform. In other words, there's different versions of the iOS, the Apple operating system, and you don't want to do something that works beautifully on the iPhone 5 but crashes on the iPhone 4. Because what will happen is that half your congregation will run screaming to you that the app doesn't work. Apple is bad, Android is terrible. Does anybody here work for Google? Work for Android? Ever have? Own stock in it? Okay. The problem with Android is that it has released the Android operating system into the wilds, into the world, and it means that everybody can use it, but they can use any version they want. So Samsung may be using 4 different versions, HTC may be using several different versions, et cetera, et cetera. And again, you run the risk of creating an app that runs really fine under Strawberry Pie, but doesn't run very well under Ice Cream Sandwich. I don't make these up. These are the sort of nicknames of the various Android releases. So this is a nightmare to maintain, because anytime the vendor comes out with a new version of their operating system, you may have to modify the app. This is a horrible job. I've done it. The alternative is what are called web apps. And a web app is an app that does not follow a platform standard, it follows a browser standard. So what that means is that it's basically a web site or a web page, and it will run in a browser. So it will run in Safari, it will run in Internet Explorer, it will run in whatever browser your users have. So the drawback is that they cannot easily run, or at all run, the GPS, the camera, the accelerometers. What takes me 10 clicks in a native iPhone app might take me several pages worth of coding in a web app. Also, the apps are not on the phone because basically they're websites. But they're easier to maintain because there are fewer browsers around than there are versions of Android, which means there's less maintenance. Basically, what you're doing is creating a website, but making sure that website fits into the screen without having to do pinch and zoom and scroll and all that stuff. So in some respects, this is more limited, but it's also more flexible and less of a pain in the neck. What you get is less interaction, less interactivity with a web app, but it's easier to use. So let me tie this together, and then I'll tell you how to create these things. Is this making sense so far? All right, is anybody deciding you want nothing to do with mobile at this point? Okay. Some things we have to know, what we want to make mobile. It's a crucial thing. There's a common strategy here that comes out of business years ago. It used to be known as there's never enough time to do it right, but there may be time to go back later and fix it, we think. All right. This has now been shortened in the internet age. It's now known as ready, fire, aim, oops. Okay, you don't want to do this. Who the users are, what they expect, what devices we support, does whatever mobile thing we create need web access, who's the author, who's going to be creating it, maintaining it, doing tech support on it. And what you'll find is that it is not necessarily easy, but it is not as hard as you may think. If you've never done this before, this looks like total gibberish. It's not that hard, and it's getting simpler. So what I want to do now is talk about how to go mobile, what your options are for actually doing this. And what I want to do is start by the most bland, simple, boring but cheap option you have, and that's PDF. Then we'll look at ebooks and then go up the scale of coolness until we get to the apps. And again, requiring a surprisingly low degree of technical skill. You don't have to know Objective-C, you don't have to know JavaScript, you don't have to know MIME types and all this other stuff. All right, PDFs. Is anybody not familiar with PDF? Anybody not sure what it is? It's been around for years, but I just have to ask. Okay, basically it's really simple because all you do is you write your material and you convert it to PDF. You can buy the tools needed to do that from Adobe for I think $495, or you can download a free converter that will do the same thing. So it costs you almost nothing, but it's boring. It's like reading a piece of paper on the screen. You can jazz it up. You can add 3D animated graphics. You can add video. I've done this, but frankly, it's not worth it. And unless you're a professional technical writer or programmer, you're probably not going to have the tools, but you could. How do you distribute this stuff? This is that list of links that I said I would give you, depending on what you want to distribute it to. Do you want to distribute it to a laptop or a desktop? Just put it on a server. Do you want to distribute it onto a tablet? There's all different ways of doing this, and rather than suggesting one specific set of steps to follow, what I'm doing is recommending that you do various Google searches and see what hits you get and just read them and see which one makes the most sense. Because what I find to be clear, you may not, and vice versa. But how to download a PDF to a tablet. Remind me, who's got the Kindle? Okay. For you, I don't know if have you ever downloaded a file to a Kindle? Yeah. Okay, you know how easy it is to do. You just send that file to a particular URL, and then it opens up in the Kindle. That's basically it. So there's almost nothing to it. It's like sending an email. All right, ebooks. Have any of you written a book? Do any of you want to write a book? All right. Biggest problem with this stuff is There's really two problems. One is writing the book. Second problem is getting the book published. I've had 4 books published in my career on computers. 2 of them were published by real publishers in the 80s. It was a horrible experience. It took 4 months to get the book through production. Last year, I found this tool called Create Space, which is a do-it-yourself publishing tool run by Amazon. And I put my first book into publishable form to the point where you could order it on Amazon. It took me 6 hours. And I just sat there and sort of gaping at the screen going, huh? The second one, once I knew what I was doing, took 4 hours. It is incredibly simple, and you can now find these books on Amazon. But then somebody said, can you convert these to Kindle? And the answer is sure. Except it turns out, and Amazon will help you, but it turns out that there are some peculiarities in Amazon's own process that can cause tremendous headaches. So I'm actually still experimenting on how to find a smooth procedure that will let me do everything in one pass. I think I've found it. I just haven't actually tried it yet. But my point is, if you want to create an ebook, there's various ways to do it, but as long as you don't have bulleted lists, or as long as you don't have computer screenshots, the process works like a charm. And if you want other options, again, do a Google search for how to create ebooks, or you can hire a service bureau that will do this for you, and they're quite affordable. Or, does anybody here actually like to play with code? Okay, one guy. All right. If you like playing with code, there's a book that I recommend. It's called EPUB Straight to the Point by a woman named Elizabeth Castro. Excellent book, and it's almost like a step-by-step tutorial on how to create an ebook. And it's incredibly tedious and boring, but surprisingly easy. How do you distribute? Again, you can use Amazon. There's a service that Barnes & Noble offers called BookBaby. And the obvious point, the likely scenario is, well, let's publish to both. The problem is you can't, because Amazon and Barnes & Noble don't like each other. And there's a real risk that if you pick one, you may be barred from the second one. You'd have to check the service agreements, but it is doable. All right, which takes me into the app world. Okay, is everybody still with me? All right, no questions? This is still making sense? Okay, you're not just humoring me. Okay, web apps. Jason talked about these yesterday. He mentioned them as an alternative to native apps. Again, think of a web app as basically a website that is optimized for fitting into a screen the size of a Post-it note. So how do you do it? Well, a couple of things you can do. If you are not a coder, and again, I'm assuming nobody here is, except Kirk, you can take your church's regular website and convert it to a mobile optimized form. It's not an app. It's still a website, but it's been modified to fit into the screen. There's a number of tools that are out there now that will let you do this. There's one called Doodah Mobile, and I have a URL for it here. But what Doodah Mobile will do is take your existing website and literally automatically or semi-automatically convert it to a format that fits better into a mobile device screen. And it works surprisingly well, but it has one surprising flaw, which I'll get to in a minute. But here's an example. Here's my regular website. This thing's actually kind of old. I've got to update it, but basically this is the site. So I've got links, I've got graphics, I've got highlights, etc., which is good. Except, what if you want to look at this on an iPhone? This is what you get. It still works. Still perfectly usable, but between the pinching and the zooming and the scrolling, it works, but not particularly well. So what I want to do, or what I need to do, is convert this to a form that will fit on a mobile device. And what I did was I used Doodah, and this is what I got. Now, so what you're seeing, and I don't particularly like these colors either, in case anyone was going to say that, but didn't want to. I just used Doodah's defaults just to see what it would look like. And this is certainly much more legible. And I can, I now have these buttons that I can click. They're much bigger. They're much easier to hit with a fingertip, which is a lot fatter than a mouse pointer. All right, it is still a website. It's not an app. And it's cheap. It's $9 a month. They will charge you $9 a month to host it. This is how they make their money. So, not bad. Where this breaks, it turns out that if you look at what I have here, let me back up a couple of slides. This is my original one. This has everything from links to podcasts, links to a blog that I run, links to my guide to great barbecue joints across North America. I spend way too much time on the road. But I also accept unsolicited submissions if you want to be famous. I have a banner ad. I have columns. I have all kinds of stuff here. And what these tools will do is faithfully say, okay, let's create a page called services. And let's create a page called project control documents. And let's create a page called resources. And it's trying to shoehorn this material into a format for which it was never designed, and the result looks horrible. In other words, what you have to do is redesign your original website with a view toward being converted to mobile in the first place. In other words, it takes some rethinking, especially if your churches have websites now. It's not just a matter of saying, let's squeeze the website into an iPhone screen. It won't work. Or it will work, but it won't be very usable or pretty. Sir?
With that Doodah, do you pick whether it's Apple, Android? So I just went on my Android, and it's not like that on.
Yep. Yeah, the question was with Doodah, do you specify whether it's Apple or iPhone or Android? No, because remember, Doodah is not a native app. It's a web app, which means it's running in a browser. So what Doodah will do is try to convert your website to a mobile optimized form that runs in any browser within reason, any mainstream browser. So we haven't gotten to the iPhone versus Android business yet. Bear with me, that's next. So in other words, you can, if you know the old expression GIGO, G-I-G-O, garbage in, garbage out, this website has served me faithfully for years. I wouldn't call it garbage, especially since I created it. But when it comes to using this as the basis for being converted to mobile, this is garbage. It doesn't work. So that said, how do you distribute it? Easy, put it on a server. Or they'll do it for you for $9 a month. It's worth it. All right, which brings me to native apps. And sir, this is going to answer your question now. You can work in code. For example, here's a fairly straightforward chunk of code for an app. Okay, it's pretty straightforward if you understand code. I teach coding. I've taught coding for years. It's one of the things that I do, and I can look at this and still shudder to think that I would ever work like this, and I have. But my all-time record in working like this for the number of errors that I got in one program at one time was 453 errors. And I'm still kind of proud of that. It turned out that I was hand coding, typed one command, made a mistake, copied it, and pasted it 450 times. So I really had 3 errors. But I had one of those moments when I think my heart stopped. So, you can work this way, but you don't have to. So instead, what you can do is look at, and this is what I'm going to get into now with apps, the native apps. There's a growing number of tools that are called GUI, Graphic User Interface app development tools that try to hide the programming from you. Here's an example. Here's one. It's called iBuildApp. And again, I've got the URL. And create Android and iPhone app in 5 minutes. And you can do it. It works surprisingly well. You are limited to using their template. So they've got 6 or 8 different templates from which you can choose. You have a limited set of colors from which to choose. But if you can live within those constraints, it's actually pretty straightforward. Here's a partial list of the features. Supports major mobile platforms. So I don't know if you can read this, but it says iOS and Android. Notification. Supports push notification, GPS notification. Push notification is a feature that lets the app send a message to your phone. Church canceled due to snowstorm. Advertising. Promotional tools. You can add a QR code. You guys all familiar with the QR codes? Anybody not sure what they are? It's, if you've ever seen these, hang on a second, I'll show you. Where are we, 41? This thing down at the bottom, it's like an expanded barcode. You could scan this with a scanner. It's called a QR code reader that you can actually get as an app for your phone, and it would do something. In this case, this would just give you my contact information, but I've seen one example that I saw that was not specifically church related, but I think a church app would be an interesting use of this thing, was you know how in whatever town you live, there are always old sepia tone photographs that were taken of standing here looking down Main Street in 1897. And you might today want to stand there and look down Main Street, except if you did, you would be run over by a semi-trailer. But you're wondering, if I stand here and look, what did it look like 100 years ago? And there have been a number of experiments where people have found these old photographs, digitized them, put them on the web, and if you're standing here, they splashed one of those big QR codes, just painted it on the side of the building here, and you can scan it with your phone, and you'll get the picture on the phone, and you can look, here's today, look at the phone, here's yesterday. It's actually very slick. There's a lot of other features that's been used for, but I think that's one of the most interesting ones. Here's what our church looked like in 1911. Here's what it looks like today. Or here's what it looked like in the 16th century. Various other things you can do. All right, here's another example. This is one called App Maker. And again, this does things like to create an app in minutes. Well, yeah, that's sort of true. Use RSS. And look at analytics. Here's that push. There's a sort of an oddly worded thing down here. It says monetize, which is really a terrible English way of saying, how can we make money from this? Could be, as Jason suggested yesterday, if your church has some products that it might want to sell, this might be a way to let people buy products, almost like adding an online store. And here's the build page. And again, it's asking you, choose your app style. What's the name of the app? This is one that I was working on that was a guide to barbecue joints in Austin, Texas. And barbecue is sort of a theme in my business travel. Again, you can pick different graphics. And again, this is largely point and click. There's no coding. here's a third one. This is the one that I happen to use. This is the one that I'm going to be using in the second session. This is called VisiApps. And this is the main development screen. And you'll notice there's a lot going on here. In fact, there's more going on here than there were on the other two that I showed you. And that's one reason why I hooked up with this company, because the first two that I showed you are very good, and you actually can create an app in minutes. Although when somebody says you can do something in minutes, without specifying how many 100 minutes it's going to be, but it's not going to be weeks or months. It is going to be maybe days, but you're limited to their template. This tool lets me do anything I want. This is almost totally unlimited. And it pays. So again, this is the screen where I lay out the individual screens in the app. This is the screen where I lay out the data management, where I connect the app to the underlying data, which could be things like links to the sermons, could be things like announcements, could be prayer requests, any sort of entry that you want to put into the app for the staff to see or for the congregation to see. All right, the beauty of these things is that they are supposed to let non-programmers create apps quickly, and by and large they do. Of course, there's a lot of slack in the word supposed to and non-programmer. They do keep you out of the code, but a couple of issues. Number one, defining your goals and your workflow takes some effort. Again, one of the biggest mistakes that people make with these tools, and I've done this myself, is you look and you say, aha, there's no coding, I can jump into this and get going right away. And you spend about maybe a day or so before you realize, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm flailing because I never defined what I want my app to do in the first place. So you have to define your goals. And if any of you are planning to come to the next session, the actual hands-on session, bear with me 1 second. Things got a tad rushed coming in here. But one of the things I'm going to do is pass out, there we go, is pass out a copy of a planning and design screen, a template. There's 4 pages here. This is modeled after the iPhone screen, although it works well enough as a template to start laying out your pages for the Android as well. And I don't know how well you can see it, but you see the shaded area? That's what you have to work with. You have very little. And in fact, I don't know if you can see it, but in the shaded area, I've got a set of grid lines to try to force me to fit the text within the screen rather than writing in your usual sprawling way. In other words, you have to define what the flow is, how the app's going to work. And that can be difficult.
Neil,
Yeah.
with all the different online kind of dashboard interfaces, WYSIWYG, right, that you're showing us, obviously you think VisiApps is a great tool because you work for them, but why would you say that that's better than the other ones?
Okay, yeah, the question basically is, why do I like VisiApps? Actually, I'll tell you the truth, I don't think they're a great tool because I work for them. It actually went the other way. I'm an independent consultant, so I really don't work for anybody. But over the years, I've become certified in a number of tools, some of which are completely outside this field. But the thing that I liked about them, in fact, hold that thought, because see this comment down here, the yikes moment? That's where I'm going to answer your question. It may force you to use the vendor's templates, but to sort of start answering your questions now, a lot of the other ones, there are a lot of tools out there that are totally flexible that may cost you $1 million. VisiApps and a lot of the tools in this category are free. VisiApps costs the development engine using the authoring platform that I just showed you here and here, costs you nothing. The company makes its money through hosting.
Sure.
So the fact that it's free is obviously a big sales pitch for anything. So that's one reason. The second reason was that in the free category, the way a lot of the vendors set it up was that you had to use their templates. So if you don't mind, if you can look at a template that they have and say, well, it's not what I had in mind, but it's okay, that's fine. But if you don't like their approach, you're stuck. Whereas with VisiApps, I can do anything I want. Sometimes things that I shouldn't have done, but that's how you learn. Depends on the desired level of data management. As you'll see, a lot of these tools, the question is, what's data? Because if you don't have that much data, and if, let's say, the data you have consists of grabbing chunks of information off the internet and presenting them as part of the app, then these other tools do that nicely. But if you want your own proprietary data, your own church data, your announcement list, then that can start limiting what the tools you can select from, because different tools support different kinds of data. And the thing that I liked about them was that they supported almost anything, but at the lowest level. And data management is the point where everybody gets terrified, as you'll see in a minute, but including VisiApps. But VisiApps, in my opinion, is the least terrifying. And I'll show you why in a minute. And then there's the yikes moment. So here's the yikes moment for iBuild app, where you're creating the app and you're filling in templates and you're finding cool new graphics. Then you get to this thing that says API key generate. And your first thought is, what on earth is an API key? So you click generate, you get the API access key right here, and that's great. And you look at this, and it says, I have no clue what this is. So you're wondering, what is this? And it says read documentation. So this will surely help explain why this API key is so important. And you open the documentation, and the first thing it says is iBuild app provides soap. All right, the premium version adds towels. In other words, even the explanation is terrifying. SOAP is actually an internet standard. Here's the yikes moment for AppMaker. When it's asking, where do you want to get your content for your tabs? And one of the things it's asking you to do is select the home URL for your RSS Atom feed. What on earth is an RSS Atom feed? And if you're forcing me to go off and figure out what this is, even before I can pick it, this is one of those things where you suddenly slam on the brakes. All right, in VisiApps, this is the yikes moment. But what's interesting about this, although you can't quite tell from what you see here, is that at the simplest level, the database for VisiApps is a spreadsheet. Has anybody here never used a spreadsheet, like Excel, something like that? Does everybody have at least minimal experience? You know what a spreadsheet is? Has anybody never used a spreadsheet? Okay. The business side of your church operations, church finance management, probably uses a spreadsheet. VisiApps, at its simplest level, uses Google Docs spreadsheets as the database. And I have done some surprisingly powerful things using a spreadsheet. And the beauty of the spreadsheet is that everybody knows what a spreadsheet is. It's still a yikes moment. When you look at this, it still looks pretty terrifying at first, until you realize that all you're doing is really telling the tool to pass information from a field, from a column in the spreadsheet to a field on the device. That's all you're doing. So after the initial moment of terror, you realize, wait a minute, this is spreadsheet work. I know this. Does it work? In other words, for all this talk, does it work? Well, in about 40 hours, I did this. This was the original version of the church app. The one that I've shown you so far and the one that we'll work with in the second session has a black background, which I really don't like. I like the blue much better, but the church was my client. The church decided they wanted black. Black it is. This has taken me about 48 hours. It took me about 40 hours to design the thing, build the database, and then I've spent about 8 hours fighting with Apple. That's not bad, though. This one took under 8 hours. This was an app that I did for something called a technology showcase or a technology incubator. You guys familiar with technology incubators? We see these a lot in a lot of states, for example, will have shared facilities for high-tech startups. So I'll invite this company and that company and that company, and I say, come on in, we're going to give you free office space, accounting support, and business consulting advice for a year. At the end of that time, we're going to have an exposition where all 30 of you exhibit your products, and we're going to bring in people from the outside world to walk around, look at the products, and vote on which one they think is the coolest. And since cool is important, the vote is going to be done through an app. This is the app that I did for one of these showcases that was held at MIT about 2 months ago. I did the app in about 6 hours. And it was used by 300 people to vote. And I spent an evening with my heart in my throat, wondering if the thing was going to crash, and it didn't. Under 8 hours. This one was an app for a conference that was held in Chicago last year. Restaurant recommendations, visuals, so you could actually take pictures of the people that you were meeting at the conference that you'd been talking to via email for years, but you had no idea what they looked like. And you see them and you say, oh, you're Kirk. Is it Kirk or Kurt? Kirk, gotcha. You're Kirk, great, let me take a picture of you. And I take a picture, and all the pictures would go into a database. Contact information, session list. In a sense, this is similar to the Groupio app, but it's a little more wide-ranging because of things like restaurant recommendations. All right, how do we distribute this stuff? Again, we have got to get it into the stores. Again, Apple can be a pain in the neck. The gentleman from Saddleback, is there anybody else here from a church similar in size to Saddleback? Okay. You may be the only one who does this or who's able to do this. You can create your own store. So that now, rather than having to publish apps up to the App Store and having to put up with Apple's vagaries, you can create the Saddleback store, and you define the criteria for acceptance. You have your own store. All right, so let me sum this up. There's various ways to go mobile. Without being a techie, without having to hire a techie. If you have a techie on call, so much the better, but you don't need one. The main issues are really to define what it is you're trying to do. Then you pick the output. In other words, do we want to create an app? If it's an app, do we want to create a native app versus a web app? Then you pick only then do you pick the tools, the authoring tools, and then you go ahead and do it. And it is, as I say, surprisingly simple and mechanically. What we're going to do in part 2, if any of you are planning to be in part 2, is we're going to examine a real app, that church app that I did in VisiApps. What I'll do is I'll walk you through the app, walk you through the authoring tool, explain how the tool works, explain design criteria for creating an app, and then if you want, I will modify the app live, and if you want, you can do that yourselves. So, does anybody have any questions?
What is the cost for hosting?
Yeah. What question is, what's the cost? You mean for the VisiApps hosting or in general?
The church, for example?
I would have to check because they change The prices seem to change.
I mean, roughly.
Yeah, roughly we're talking about, it's either somewhere between 100 to 150 a month. So in the commercial sense, it's
One app. Per app.
right. It's per app, but irrespective of how many users you have. So you might have one app with 10 million users. It's still 100 to 150 a month.
If you prepay as a nonprofit, it's $8.95.
If there are discounts for prepayment as a nonprofit
$12.95 for the whole year.
for the year.
For a year.
Yep. So okay, so you're checking. What is it? Was it 100 a month or 150? Or 99?
It's 99. Yeah. I mean that's
Okay.
just a standard pricing.
The
That's
standard
same
price.
as nonprofit.
Okay.
For
Yeah.
1 year.
And $10 per month.
Per month. Yeah. I just always qualify that because at one point I said it was X dollars per month without realizing that they'd lowered the price that morning. So there are many ways to put your foot in your mouth when you do presentations. But so we're talking about $1,200 a year minus a discount for nonprofits. I believe there's also a discount if you prepay for a whole year. So it's pretty cheap. All right. Other questions? Sir?
This is not really just related to apps, but I saw you had mentioned podcasts and you had that on your website. You know, so these don't take as much space as like a video would, but you know, you have to have them in there. And that's something that I think there's still future in pod. And I'm wondering as far as space on that, you know, if you have any advice about podcast, you know, hosting as far as that kind of thing.
Yeah, the question was basically, do I have any thoughts about podcasting in terms of the technical requirements?
Especially space and hosting.
Okay, especially space and hosting. I haven't done that much with podcasting in recent years, so take everything I'm going to say with a big grain of salt. What's happened in recent years has been the emergence of what's called the cloud. All right, you've probably heard the term. I don't know if you know what it means, but it used to be known as SaaS, which stood for Software as a Service, which really doesn't help. Best illustration I can give you of the cloud is that if you go back, say, 100 years, a lot of factories or apartment buildings or stores would have their own generators, their own electrical plants, because electrical service was kind of uncertain, it was undependable. So Biola might have its own electrical generating plant. And what's happened is that as service has gotten more and more reliable, those things fell out of favor. We no longer needed them. So now what's happened is that if you need electricity, you plug your computer into a wall socket and electricity comes out. You have no clue where that electricity is being generated, nor do you care. It's as if there's a cloud somewhere up there that electricity comes out of. That's basically cloud computing. What's happened is that more and more things, and cloud computing is cheap, dirt cheap. Google will give you cloud access. I think it's 5 gigabytes a year for something like $50 a month, which is almost throwaway. It's like a rounding error. So what's happened is that more and more things are moving into the cloud because it's cheap. And I now have, are any of you doing e-learning? Is anybody doing training? Okay, this analogy won't work then, but there's a number of tools that are available now that I can use on a mobile device to create training videos right here. If you need a video showing you how to change a tire, if you need a video showing you how to make a creme brulee, anything, I can pull out my iPhone, make the video, and send it up to the cloud instantly. And what that comes down to, I'm not dancing around your question, what that comes down to is that once stuff is in the cloud, storage is almost irrelevant. Because you've got 5 gigabytes worth of storage space. So all you know is that your podcast is now up in the cloud and it's accessible via a web link, via URL. So what's happening, and again, like I said, I haven't done enough with podcasting in recent years to be confident of this, but what I find is that there are more and more things that I used to do a few years ago where I was worried about space requirements because they would have to sit on my hard disk, or I would have to squeeze them onto one of these things. And now, as it's going into the cloud, I just don't care.
So the main idea, though, is that it's become sufficiently inexpensive, because even a while back on certain podcast setup that I looked at, I thought it was still a little bit on the high, maybe because it was just more a commercial place as opposed to just raw storage.
I would have to know more about what you were looking at, but my first thought is, yes, I agree.
Yeah.
All right, I would take a look at cloud-based podcasting. And if you can't find it, by the way, here's my contact information. If you get stuck, shoot me an email, and I can find it because I have some friends who do a lot of podcasting. Yes, ma'am?
If you use Busy Apps or another of the other places that you told us about, who owns it? Do they own it?
Yes, these are commercial.
But I'm putting my information out there, and I'm just basically using this to try and get people to, I mean, whatever I want my app to do.
Oh, who owns the app?
I'm using yeah, exactly. Who owns it? I put my creativity in it,
Right.
but I'm using their
You own it.
template.
You own the app. You own the intellectual property in the app. You're using their template, but actually you're not even using their well, depending on what tool you're using, you may be using their template or you may be creating your own, which the tool will let you do. But the fact is, when you create an app using their template or their design tools, it's your intellectual property. It's your content. It's your stuff. So you own it. You know, it's like saying, if I use Microsoft Word to write the Sunday Bulletin, does Microsoft own a portion of the content? Absolutely not. You're simply using Microsoft Word as an authoring tool, but the content is all yours. The output is all yours. Absolutely. In fact, if any tool tells you otherwise, I would run from them. All right, other questions? Comments? Arguments? All right, good, right on time. Thank you very much. I hope this has been useful. I hope to see some of you back for part 2.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.